So now we'll come to item 17, South New Brighton Regeneration Planning. So if we could have staff to the table for this, please. And we'll take any questions first of all. But my thinking is that it might be good just to get an overview from staff as we move into this, and particularly bearing in mind the issues that have been raised through the deputation and the petition. Richard, would it be possible for us just to get a very brief overview of current work that's going on or that's proposed to be happening related to the South Shore area, just so that we can get an overview of the various streams of work that are going on and what's proposed and when it's likely to happen, just briefly?
Yep. So the report itself responds to a resolution which is specific to South New Brighton, so hence the reason for focusing on that area. It does touch on, that resolution was nested in 3 resolutions in total. One of them was in relation to the OSIL report, which is specific to South Shore, and that's something that staff will be reporting back to Council by the end of August, so that is already in train. So that's one piece of work which is specific to South Shore. The other one, which is not specific to South Shore but does address issues that occurred there over the weekend, is the Emergency Management Recovery Plan, which the Chief Executive just referred to. So that's obviously broader than South Shore itself, because it deals with all the areas affected by the weekend's events. But some of those areas were obviously in South Shore, so it will look at what happened there and will respond to it. And the third piece of work, which is a broader piece of work, which is going to be led by Regenerate Christchurch, is a regeneration strategy for the wider South Shore, South New Brighton area. And that also responds to a council resolution that stemmed from the annual plan. So there were 3 resolutions in total. One that directed council staff to look at South New Brighton, which was specific to the earthquake impacts on that area. The other one was in relation to the OSIL report, which you'll get a staff report back to you by the end of August. And the other one was in relation to seeking that Regenerate Christchurch proceed and progress with their regeneration strategy as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much indeed for that. No, I think, you know, the underlying message there is that, and it probably addresses one of the concerns that we may otherwise have had. Clearly, there's a need for a joined-up approach here, and obviously it's a joined-up approach that we're taking wherever possible. Great. So that allows for further questions now. So Glenn, Dave, Pauline. Glenn.
Thank you. Would it be your view that there would be scope here, and feel free to say just no, to add a call on to the government to please hurry up with a national policy statement on sea level rise?
I happened to be in attendance at yesterday's ITE meeting, and
so that's obviously something which is underway.
To get on with that work over national policy on climate change and sea level rise, because this is not helpful that we have these approaches. We actually need some leadership from the government over this. And if you consider that would be in the scope of this, could we add it?
I think that would be a good idea. Apparently we've already written to the Crown twice on these matters over the last few years, as was discussed at yesterday's ITE meeting. So I think it was agreed yesterday that another letter should be forthcoming from Council to raise that matter with the Crown.
So would you can we find that reading perhaps and put it in?
That would be your call, but...
So Pauline, as the chair of the committee, clearly there was some discussion at your meeting yesterday.
Well, that was to request council to write a letter, so if we can do that today, it would be even better.
All right, so do you want to come up with some wording that reflects that?
Well, I suggest that we retrieve that wording that we came up with yesterday, if you could find... Thank you.
All right, so if we can do that in the meantime while we've got the other Q&A going on, that would be good, and then we'll see whether we can incorporate that into the resolutions here. Next question is from Dave.
Thank you. Look, I find that section 5.1 to 5.4 is a little bit, well, not misleading, but it has gaps in it. So our first action refers to work on the South Shore OSL consultants report and how we may deal with that. The second action talks about Regenerate Christchurch's review of proposed timelines, and the third action refers to the report that we've got in front of us for South New Brighton. I've been hammering on for God knows how long now about the fact that there is a gap in the whole process where the domain frontage of South New Brighton doesn't fall into anything, and it's just something that sits in a void. We have a situation in the weekend where contractors did a fantastic job filling in the gaps at South Shore and preventing flooding down there. If not for their quick and prompt action as a request from the camping ground, the camp would have flooded as well. So here we have a situation where the estuary edge and the domain frontage is eroded badly. The high ground is just getting eaten away because it's got no protection in front of it, and very shortly will be open to the lower land behind it, and the camping ground will flood. So I'm concerned that, yes, very good that we've got a regeneration plan that's going to address issues in the South Brighton area either side of Bridge Street, and yes, we are expecting a report back at the end of August that's going to deal with the South Shore regeneration plan, maybe with the OSL thing, but in the middle there's this bit that sits nowhere.
So this is the context of a question?
The context of the question is that really is, are we going to come up with a strategy now that deals with that bit, because we've got this gap in the whole program.
Tom? My understanding is that the OSL report that will come back in August will address that area. But
no, it's not. It's going to, the report that's coming back at the end of, and I've had it from Tom himself, he does not have a mandate to deal with anything other than South Shore.
Thank you for the comments and questions.
3 or 4 days ago.
Yeah, absolutely. We did meet on site. The current resolution describes South Shore in isolation. It is apparent that it would be, how can I say, the concerns raised by the community relate to many issues. Some are inundation, some are erosion, some are with the stormwater network, as we heard today. Considering these issues in totality along the frontage of the estuary makes logical sense, and it would be appropriate to respond to these matters in totality. Given the short time frame we've had with addressing the South Shore issues and the concerns raised by this community, I would recommend that we continue with our reporting in the end of August and endeavour to include this area in that reporting as much as possible. But I'll just highlight that if directed by council, that some additional time might be appropriate to consider this area in fullness.
Well, I'm not sort of encouraged that we're going to get much of a show on this area, and maybe if I could ask the Chief Executive, and under the recovery process post the event, can we address some action on this area here? In fact, we had contractors on site that were quite happy to do this work, but we're not going to let them.
No, we have to be really clear about what is recovery and temporary work as opposed to what will be medium and long term, and we need to link those up but not confuse them. The work around the medium term response, I think needs to, we need to figure that out quite carefully, make sure we've got all the engineering. It's not just a contracting issue. We need to really understand how it's going to impact and what we need to do.
Well, we have the situation where we've just signed a lease with the camping ground.
Point of order.
30-year lease.
Point of order. Are we in debate?
I'm happy to let the question continue.
I'm asking questions.
Yep, I'm happy to let the question continue.
So here we have one of council's assets of some value that was at extreme risk during that event, and I'm really asking why we cannot just progress with some emergency works to prevent that asset being at risk in further events. We seem to be sitting on our hands with this particular piece of our coastline. It's not in Tom's piece of work coming up, it's not in anything else, and it's just going to keep further eroding and be at risk to inundation, and a major asset of ours is at risk.
Yep, so let's get an answer to the specific question.
So those things will be considered under the recovery plan. It's not something that we can say right now, this is what we're going to do, because we need to actually assess what needs to happen right now and what the engineering solutions and supports are for that.
Yeah, okay, it just seems ironic that we have to actually get to a critical status before anything gets done.
Well, that's
South
not
Shore is a classic example of that. We had to have a storm of some magnitude to actually execute.
Point of order. Are we in debate or are we asking questions?
Okay, I'm keen to move on and stick to questions now, and there will be the opportunity, obviously, to raise any of these issues in debate. Pauline.
Oh, yes, thank you. Look, I might have missed it, but I'm just wondering if you can expand on the Coastal Futures project. I'm just not sure what that is and who's responsible for that.
So this report responds to the council resolution which is specific to South New Brighton, but what we sought to do as part of that was provide you with a brief update on other related work streams. Now, one of the matters that Regenerate Christchurch are looking to progress is a regeneration strategy for the wider area. So that will look at a range of issues which are both immediate, medium and long term, which will be similar to those sorts of matters that would be considered as part of the Coastal Futures project. Now, the Coastal Futures project is a separate program of work which envisages extensive community participation and engagement around adaptive management measures. And really what it was an opportunity that we didn't have through the district plan review to engage with the community on those coastal hazard type issues. So if you recall back from a couple of years ago, that specific chapter was removed from the district plan, and we were given an opportunity to address it outside of that streamlined process. So really the Coastal Futures project was going to be a front runner to some kind of coastal hazards plan change. So what we envisaged was extensive community participation and engagement as part of that project, and then what would likely flow out of it would be a coastal hazards plan change, and that's what the revised order in council envisages. But what we're talking about here is a possibility of specifically looking at the South Shore and South New Brighton area through a regeneration strategy and addressing some of those issues specific to that area there, and using that as a bit of a front runner to the wider coastal hazards project.
So council's leading that?
No, Regenerate Christchurch is leading the regeneration strategy.
Yeah, but
we will be working in tandem with them.
So the regen strategy is called the Coastal Futures project. I'm just a bit confused about it.
No, the regen strategy will be specific to South New Brighton and the South Shore area. Coastal Futures would be a wider piece of work to look at the coastline throughout the district. And that would be our work stream.
Pardon?
And that's something that council would lead.
Yes, right, thank you. I just wanted that clarified. I didn't get it.
Thank you. Okay, I've got Yanni and then Dion.
Thanks. Just 3 questions. One is, do we have a copy of the response from the previous letters we've sent before we agree to 3? Or can someone tell us what the response has been?
Is that do we have that information?
I don't have that to hand. I was only made aware that we'd written to them previously at yesterday's ITE committee meeting. So I can
I just think if we're
try and
writing
track
back
down
again
those
for the third
responses.
time, and we went through this with Heritage, it's quite good to be able to refer to the response. We also did it with the State-owned Enterprise Minister for New Zealand Post. It's quite good to know what they've said so that we can actually respond. And obviously you've got scope within that to tailor the letter, but it would be good for us as councillors to know what we've actually been told previously so that we can give, I think, greater direction. So maybe we can get those replies circulated,
Yes.
and then when the letter's drafted, circulated around, and we can feed in any points that we might
Yeah, I mean,
want to
certainly
include.
for the content of the letter referred to in 3, to be informed by any responses that we've had to previous correspondence would be a reasonable expectation.
Agreed.
Second question is, in the Merrill Task Force flooding report, the South Shore Red Zone clearance was highlighted as a key recommendation for future work, investigation, action. It said we were waiting for agreement with Sarah. Is the reason that nothing's happened in this area been around the ongoing lack of agreement with government over what we do? I'm just trying to understand why it's taken so long, given we knew about this in 2014, and if there's any other things we need to do in terms of not just writing to the Minister for the Environment, but actually writing to LINZ, or the Earthquake Recovery Minister.
Look, I'm not familiar with the Merrill Task Force and the directions that sat within it. We were asked to respond to the resolutions that stem from this year's annual plan, and this report is specific to South New Brighton, but seeks to provide a bit of wider context on the other work that's happening.
Okay.
And as I indicated, Regenerate Christchurch are keen to lead in tandem with us a regeneration strategy for that area. They're keen to get going, as are we. So
what I'm interested in is, we identified the problem in 2014. I'm interested in understanding, and maybe we need a separate resolution to get a report back on the Merrill Task Force for flooding on what work's been done, what work's outstanding, and how that's been monitored. And I am thinking that perhaps we need to consider setting up a task force around this, or re-establishing the task force, because it does seem to me concerning the length of time taken, and also obviously you've heard the community frustration, and it seems like new entities keep getting set up. We heard someone say we don't want to be told again that the reason for the delay is we're waiting on council for action. So I think from a governance point of view, well, my question really is, who's monitoring the flooding task force recommendations work, and do you think actually it would be better to have a governance structure that actually focused, on what the solutions are for this area, to get it done quicker rather than just waiting and waiting and waiting?
So, I mean, some aspects of that question are for governors to consider rather than for staff to perhaps give advice on, and certainly it relates to the wider issue of flooding and the work done by the Merrill Task Force on flooding in 2014 and subsequent, rather than on this particular paper. I don't know, Colleen, whether that's something that you wanted to provide some comment on, or whether maybe it's something that should be referred to the Land Drainage Recovery Programme, or to the ITI committee for further consideration as to what appropriate next steps would be.
Well, can we get a report back then on what's happened with the flooding task force? I'm just concerned that we keep reinventing the wheel when we've actually spent a huge amount of effort and resource into understanding what some of these issues are, and we have solutions that have been identified, but the work's not happening.
So it may be, I mean, is that something that would be more appropriately dealt with by way of a briefing or a workshop in the first instance, to inform any changes to priority, or any any resolution around that particular work stream and so on?
Might be best, we could ask for information on any land drainage recovery program projects that are planned for South Shore, and where they are in the timeline.
Yep, and that certainly, I mean, really that's we got that brief overview on the various work streams that are underway or proposed to be underway from Richard at the start of this session, so maybe a more detailed workshop on that, but also extended to the recommendations from the Mayoral Task Force on flooding, and what the implementation of those has been, or what implementation is proposed. But that's the sort of thing I think that would be more, I mean, this is information that we're going to want sooner rather than later, because of course the events of the weekend end have brought this into perspective, and there may be some urgency around some of this work. There's certainly an interest in it, so it may be more appropriately dealt with by way of a workshop or a briefing than a formal report coming back.
Can we just have that noted or recorded, that the council asked for an urgent workshop briefing on the flooding task force and the land drainage program?
So if you need it in here, you can just ask for it and we can do that.
Yeah, and that's been noted by the Chief Executive. I think we can be confident that the request for a briefing or a workshop, whatever's most appropriate, on the work that's related to South Shore, the land drainage recovery programme, and the implementation of the recommendations of the mayoral task force on flooding in 2014. And that would pick up pretty much everything, Yanni, I think, that you've mentioned there. Thank you.
Just on that note, we've got another working group meeting on the 4th of August, and I'm sure that we will be discussing the recent events, and particularly the areas affected like South Shore and... yeah, we could do that.
Yeah, and the workshop or briefing that we've just talked about means that, obviously there's a lot of information held by those on the land drainage recovery working group. There's more information held by those on the ITI committee than by the wider council. It's an opportunity for everybody to be brought up to speed with some of the great work that's already been going on, some of the planning that's underway, and for us to be able to take a joined up approach over what we've seen this morning are a number of work streams that clearly need to be coordinated. That's fine, thank you. So back to questions. I've got Dion.
Mine might be a bit silly, but what's actually expedite actually meaning?
So,
what do you mean by expedite? Like, actually, what is it meaning?
Expedited, so as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, so that's cool, but what does it actually mean in terms of the work that you're doing? Like,
figure 1 of the report on page 105 of the agenda outlines a time frame for, albeit estimated, for delivering on the work.
And so what was the original time frame?
This responds to a resolution that came out of the annual plan, So we were asked to respond by the end of August. We've responded now. There wasn't a time frame set, as far as I'm aware. We were simply asked to respond to a report on South New Brighton and addressing the earthquake-related issues there by the end of August. So that's what we're doing. But we've used that opportunity to provide some wider context in terms of the work that's been undergoing in the wider area.
Yeah, and so obviously you're expediting this work. Is there anything that was in your original work plans that might be delayed or anything like that to expedite this?
Well, I think the Coastal Futures project is one thing, which is a wider work stream that if we look to focus on a regeneration strategy for this area, which is a bit of a test case for Coastal Futures, then there might be some difficulty in progressing those two work streams in parallel.
Okay. And have you done, is there any work that you've done in terms of what the priorities is in terms of the Coastal Futures versus this?
Well, I think this area is obviously, it's got issues. So logically, it would be one of the areas that we would focus on first if we were progressing Coastal Futures, regardless. But the idea through a regeneration strategy is to look at this area in its totality, including the area that Councillor East referred to, come up with a way forward which does address some of those issues that normally we would have looked at through the Coastal Futures project, but it will be specific to this locality. So it's based on immediate, medium and long term. So it does pick up your coastal hazard type issues such as sea level rise, etc.
So some of that Coastal Future stuff that will be delayed, is there any risk on any other areas that have potential coastal problems?
So it may not be delayed. I think that's still a decision that council will need to take, and we need to sit down with Regenerate Christchurch and work through the proposed regeneration strategy and what it means. But inherently, one would imagine if you're saying, well, if that's going to be a front runner for Coastal Futures, why would you run the two in parallel? So council was yet to make that decision. But if we are to progress with the regeneration strategy for the wider area, which addresses some of those issues that you expect through Coastal Futures, then I could see some complexities in running the two in parallel.
And that would come down to resourcing for...
Resourcing, and I think potentially consultation confusion as well. If you're going out with a regeneration strategy at the same time as you were doing coastal futures, which looked at other parts of the district, it could get confusing for members of the public.
Right. So I mean, one thing I'm thinking of here is there going to be any extra resource that you will need to be able to do this, or is it going to be balanced out?
For South New Brighton, we're comfortable we've got the resources we required to do that work, and we're comfortable with the timeframes we've suggested, albeit those being tight. In terms of the wider regeneration strategy, we'll be working with Regenerate Christchurch. We've got a project plan, not quite signed off, but almost done. We've got the resourcing in place for that as well. But I think there may be an issue with, if we were to progress that, doing it in parallel with the wider Coastal Futures project, then yes, there would be a resourcing issue in my mind if you were to run the two in parallel.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Phil.
Thanks, Richard. I'm coming from the viewpoint of having things joined up, and like there's a clear section on the South Brighton legacy earthquake issues, and I'm just wanting to ensure that, for example, the work that has been done by OSEL, that in fact when the staff examine that and its possible implementation, will a multi-hazard assessment process be used? Because at our IT committee yesterday we had a report on that, and I'm just wondering if in fact that kind of approach is going to be used in assessing, for example, work that's already done, like the OSEL report.
Best I defer to one of my more learned colleagues on that, Councillor. So, Ian, you're our technical lead, so would you like to, for South New Brighton that is, and Tom can perhaps speak to the wider matter. Yep.
I can endeavour to. We have a multi-hazard study pertaining to floodplains, so it's a large study looking at the myriad of our hazards. We're not using that approach for South New Brighton. It's more streamlined, but we are looking at multiple hazards. So we are looking a simpler approach. So we're not just looking at earthquake or flood. We're basically going to be looking at the earthquake effects, flooding, as well as groundwater, and some of those decisions to bring those into the reasons why potentially the areas weren't red zoned. That may have been some of the criteria that wasn't looked at. So that's we're extending the study to include some hazards, but it's not the definitive multi-hazard study, which is a longer term program. We don't have the time and ability to do that full study.
Okay, thanks, Ian.
So that's for South New Brighton, though.
South New Brighton.
Just for South New Brighton.
Tom might be able to speak to his response to the OSEL report.
I would just like to reiterate that yes, we will be responding to the OSEL report, and that within the Land Drainage Recovery Program we are looking to expedite all works as possible, and that we have already undertaken significant physical works across the city and will continue to do so, and that in this instance short-term, medium-term and long-term measures can be considered, and the multi-hazard is definitely looking for that long-term decision-making being best appropriate, but that's not stopping us or slowing us down from making immediate gains.
Thanks, Tom.
I was just going to add that in terms of the work that Regenerate Christchurch are doing with the regeneration strategy, there is also that opportunity to look at multiple hazards, which we will have to do across the South Shore, South New Brighton, so that will take in the area in totality. And if we've got some gaps in information, then we will need to fill those gaps, so we will be using that approach.
So the part on the wider aspect of the whole of, say, Brighton, including South Brighton, that the full assessment is going to come later. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, the area of the regeneration strategy will be focusing on South Shore and South New Brighton, so not all of New Brighton, but that would fit into the wider Coastal Futures project.
Thanks, Richard.
All right, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of questions. So we've got a set of resolutions in front of us. Item 3, Pauline, that reflects what you wanted there, given the previous comments that you made? Yep, great. All right, so do we have a mover for these resolutions? Pauline? Seconder? Yanni? Oh, right, we need a seconder first. Do I have a seconder for the resolution? Raf. Okay, so moving now into debate. Yanni.
Look, I think, you know, it's good to see something happening, but I have to say, the more that we see around the regeneration planning, I think there's a real issue with the complication and the complexity of multi-layers of bureaucracy and governance in our city. And it just seems to come back to me that if it's complicated for us to understand who's responsible for what, who's doing what, then how does the community understand what's happening and who's responsible? And I think we've heard that today through the deputation. So, you know, I'm all for this going ahead, but I do think at some stage as council, we do need to actually think about not just reinventing the wheel, but actually looking at what's the best way to do things to respond to community concerns. And at the moment, it seems to me that the whole regeneration stuff is actually so high level that it ends up taking forever. And in the meantime, the community are waiting and becoming very impatient. So I'm happy to support this today because we are going to get that report back. I would ask that when it comes back that we can actually think about how we can simplify these things. We have done as a council a huge amount of work after the 2014 floods, and yet it just feels like that work isn't being incorporated into what we're doing now, particularly in regards to South Shore. So I'll support this today, but I do think when that report comes back, it really needs to focus on a very simple way and process for which we can address these very serious issues. I don't think we need to overcomplicate it. I think there's a very simple way that it can be done, and that should be through local decision making and local elected representatives, both the community board and the council. So I look forward to that report coming back.
Glenn.
Thank you. My views on this are that obviously we need to listen to the people of South Shore. They're looking for certainty in an uncertain environment. They have a range of views, and that's absolutely fine, as we have in our communities too. My view in this, working towards regeneration for them, and regeneration is that. It's an entirely new thing. That's essentially what generation means, is that we have a duty of care. So in the short term, I'm supportive actually that we need to ensure that we are responsive over what's happened over the last few days and in the time ahead, and in the long term over regeneration planning. In the South New Brighton and South Shore area, I think it's been difficult because there have been many messages received. So if you look at the red and green zoning of South Shore, for instance, it looks like blotting paper. You've got streaks of red because there are many long driveways and houses off driveways, and streaks of green. So what I'm trying to say is, after being in a state of kind of orange for a long time, some certainty was provided, but there have still been some mixed messages sent out. Central government decreed that South New Brighton School would stay in all those changes. That sent out a signal of permanence and certainty. We've done the same over the camping ground and other facilities there, the playground, the jetty, fixing the boardwalk, etc. So what the community wants is actually some certainty, and I really urge you to support this. It's no secret David and I cover different places on the climate change spectrum, as does the community, and I think that's actually quite good, because we reflect back in many ways what the community is thinking, but what we've heard through the OSAL report is that 98% are behind it. I've walked with Scott Butcher along the estuary edge. He will point out to you the different local ecosystems which may respond to a soft edge or perhaps even a hard edge treatment. The thing is, we need a response, and so that's where David and I think are on the same page, that we need certainty for this community. On number 3, my view on this over a national policy statement, actually there's a vacuum of leadership. We need the government to step up. You look at what's going on in South Dunedin and other places, and these events have amplified the rolling trend of climate change which we're seeing. So we need some leadership here, and I would like some initial response before the election from the minister concerned. I don't want them to use the election as an excuse not to get back. So we need some initial response before that. But all in all, I hope that you support these resolutions today.
Thank you. Dave.
Thank you. Look, I'm going to support this motion today, but my comments really around regeneration planning probably highlighted by a disappointment that this time frame is so protracted, and I entirely support the comments that Councillor Johansson elaborated on a short while ago. I am really probably concerned that this plan only focuses on the mapped area in the report and excludes some of the areas a wee bit further downstream. The events over the weekend, last weekend, really highlighted many of the problems and issues in the South Brighton South Shore, and in one night these issues were solved. And these are issues that Tim Sinters and Kim Money and I have been advocating for many years. It is disappointing that things seem to get to crisis stage in the eastern suburbs before we get any action. Although it's a little off the subject, I would really like to see some immediate action on the domain frontage, and if it wasn't for action over the weekend, the camping ground would have flooded. Residents in the area really have been incredibly tolerant, but their trust in the City Council is severely strained. And look, I really want to just finish today by quoting from a meeting that we had in recent days with Richard Joseph, which I think is pretty adept to this situation. Relationships would benefit from a more professional and respectful approach on both sides in order to create trust, confidence and respect, and it seems to be sadly lacking in the South Brighton South Shore area at the moment.
Pauline.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I'll support this. But at the same time, we've got to be careful we don't underestimate the challenges here. I mean, this is the classic multi-hazard area. There's a lot of things to consider, and that's why we can't really rush long-term solutions. So I think, as we've said already, we've got quite a few work streams that we can hook into this as well, besides this. And one of them is our land drainage recovery program, and we will do some more investigations into the mayoral task force for flooding, as Councillor Johansson has suggested here. And so regarding the letter at the bottom too, I just want to say that at the local government conference on the weekend, there was mentioned many times by many people, but particularly LGNZ, that they are also putting pressure on the government to come up with this statement as well. It's needed not just in our area but all around New Zealand, and increasingly so as these events become more frequent and more intense. And so I'll support this, but also promise to be working on it as hard as I can in any other areas that I can as well, to expedite the progress.
Thank you. So, I mean, clearly there are a number of complex work streams that all come together in a joined up way, or need to come together in a joined up and coordinated way. And Pauline, I think you make a good point. You know, this work is complex. There are a number of big pieces of work here, and I think when you join up the comments that you've just made with the points that were very clearly made in the deputation and in the petition as regards community expectation and people's ability to know what the future looks like and to be comfortable in their homes, not in fear of the next flood event, or, you know, when is a piece of work that needs to be done going to be done and so on. So I think the suggestion of the workshop or the briefing, which gets all councillors familiar with the various work streams that are going on and the priorities, and going back to 2014 and the mayoral task force on flooding and those recommendations and so on, a really joined up approach across all of these work streams will be particularly helpful. But in terms of the resolution today, point 1 is a noting provision. Point 2, clearly there's this more detailed report coming back in September 2017 to the committee, and that really will be the next stage in getting some of this work underway. The letter to the Minister, I mean, that really reiterates a position that we've already taken, and then there is a sense of frustration that there is some work that clearly needs to be done in this space. It's not the first time we've had the conversation that's led to the recommendation in 3, the resolution in 3. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. Thank you.